next we have Paul J Meighan, who's sharing a presentation called The World Viewer, Heritage Language Pedagogy as a Means to Embrace Linguistic and Epistemic Diversity in English Language Learning. So whenever you're ready, Paul, feel free to start.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
That's great, thank you. So thanks, Cyril. Thank you to all of the organizers for having me today and to be invited here to speak. I'm looking forward to hearing more of the presentations over the course of today and tomorrow. So today I'll be speaking to you a little bit about the world viewer. What that is heritage language pedagogy as a means to embrace linguistic and epistemic diversity in English language learning. So a quick overview of today. I'll position myself as a researcher on this work and some background to this conceptual paper. I will highlight the problem, our inequitable colonial Western monolingual and monocultural classrooms. I'll then speak a little bit about the theoretical background, or the why, the historical context, the evolution of our Western worldview and the colonial legacy of English. I'll then think of ways in which we can move forward and put this into practice, because we all know that we've heard a lot about the issues and the problems, but how can we go about addressing these in the classroom? So I will speak about how we could go about decolonizing the English classroom for the past, present, and future of our learners for heritage language pedagogy by the transferable learning circle and the world viewer. I'll then wrap up today's presentation with some key takeaways and implications and ways in which we can carry forward the conversation. So a little about me. Who am I? Ismisha Paul Meighan Chiblo, Shegela Hanum, Hamio Glasuku, Aunanalapa, Shelenach Hanum and McGill University, Montreal, Isma Ur Kon Yechuch. So I introduce myself in my language, Scottish Gaelic, and in English, my name is Paul Meighan Chiblo. I'm a Scottish Gael from Glasgow, Scotland. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill University, and it's very nice to be speaking to you all today. I would also like to acknowledge this land, the plants, water, animals, and spirits. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land and territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'd just like to say I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land and to be speaking with you all today. So reasons behind my research. This is informed by my own personal experiences as a Scottish Gael, for example, in Scotland growing up. My language Gaelic was not made available to me in the educational system, and the language, which has been spoken for 1,500 years in Scotland, is still not recognized as a quote-unquote official language within the United Kingdom. And also, since meeting my husband in Glasgow, I've learned more about the harms of colonization on the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous languages of Turtle Island, also known as Central and North America. These experiences have driven me to enact and look at ways in which we can enable more equitable education and language policy, and my research focuses on Indigenous language revitalization and decolonizing language education. So certain views expressed during this presentation are my own, and certain constructs such as Western or Indigenous are used as there tend to be common expressions in the dominant Western way of viewing and understanding the world. However, worldviews and cultures are not static, and not all Western or Indigenous experiences are the same. So the reasons why I thought about this, the heritage language pedagogy and the world viewer, it came to me during an English for academic purposes class at a college in Toronto. I was teaching an upper intermediate level in 2019. So that's when I first put this idea into practice, but I have done it in successive sessional courses as well. This specific context in 2019 was a content-based 8-week course, and the topic was the environment. The problem that I found was that the vast majority of the texts were written from a dominant Western perspective, and a monocultural, monolingual perspective, such as a white native standard English speaker, was portrayed as a norm. And Indigenous and heritage cultures and languages were not and are not widely acknowledged or validated. And this is also evidenced by the literature. So I'll leave here a quote by Bill Hooks. Not the English language that hurts me, but what the oppressors do with it and how they can make it a weapon that can shame, humiliate, and colonize. So the belief system or worldview through which we language is fundamental, and the English language is a dominant Western language with a colonial and assimilationist legacy. This has been imposed on non-dominant cultures or quote-unquote vernacular or quote-unquote inferior languages under the tenets of civilization, linguistic imperialism, and cognitive imperialism. The dominant Western thought is characterized by a human-centered perspective, and what this does is essentializes the purpose of human beings into an imperialistic control and exploitation of Earth, nature, the human, or more than human, quote-unquote, other. So this view of English as a quote-unquote superior language can be traced back to the British Empire, where Britain sat as a mighty teacher with matchless powers of political supremacy, commerce, wealth, and literature, with all the excellences kindred to it throughout the world. And this was a quote by Reverend George in 1867. So linguistic and cognitive imperialism has led to the linguistic and ethnic genocide of peoples colonized by the British Empire. And the danger of us as language educators, particularly when we teach English, of ignoring this colonial legacy resides in a human exceptionalism or, as Bateson in 1972 puts it, an epistemological error. For example, the positivist or objective view of the Western human as being quote unquote superior to nature or quote unquote the other has led to a naive empiricism or quote unquote an arrogant elitism in applied linguistics research and teaching. And this epistemological error dominates the current mainstream Western worldview. This lack of epistemological and historical balance and consideration of social culture and political context in applied linguistics continues to be a problem. For example, colonial teaching methods, extractive racist Western research paradigms, methods, or a pursuit of quote unquote scholarly knowledge within a Western paradigm. This has upheld continued white epistemological supremacy and racisms, and the languages, unfortunately, that still tend to be acknowledged or implemented in the classroom still tend to be colonial, quote unquote, official, nation state, and or non-endangered languages. So language we use in the worldview we enact have repercussions on how we treat our environment. For example, we can categorize things in English as dirt, wasteland, or wildlife. However, if we are to call a traditional and respected territory wasteland, we may become more complicit in its mistreatment. And the same goes for wildlife. If we categorize certain animals as wildlife, we may be more complicit in the mistreatment of those animals as well. Now, language is inseparable from the environment. So the labels, the categorizations we place on things can have implications in how we treat them. So there is a need to make English language education and language more culturally and environmentally responsive. This will help pose deeper questions using a quote from Kubota in 2020 of linguistic and cultural inequalities in relation to colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and associated language ideologies. This presentation argues that a more sustainable and equitable way would be to review the dominant Western worldview, for example, human exceptionalism, linguistic imperialism, that informs ecologically and culturally destructive assumptions. So on the world level, we can see the trickle-down effect of this imbalance can be already felt through the impact of the human-caused climate and humanitarian crises. And on a classroom micro level, we can see learners experiencing a heritage language deficit lens, experiencing ethnic ambivalence or evasion, linguistic discrimination, whiteness, and learners being marginalized by white listening subjects. And a quote here by Gerald, who cautions that any educator, ELT or otherwise, not actively disrupting the status quo of whiteness or claims of neutrality on this issue, supported by economic concerns or not, are insufficient excuses for engaging with white supremacy. So this presentation argues that major contributors to the climate and humanitarian crisis and inequitable classroom environments are: one, the commodification and disembodiment of English from the environment for economic profit to meet the demands of capitalism or linguistic imperialism, and two, the lack of education or knowledge of alternative ways of knowing and being. So, for example, Indigenous worldviews are rooted in the principles of reciprocity and relationships between communities and the local environment. And a decolonizing, ecocentric, earth-centered relational worldview should be equally validated in the English classroom. As Leinen highlights, schools deeply reflect the Western worldview, which is the underlying cause for the sustainability crisis. And the goal of education would be to give future generations tools for thinking and seeing the world differently, constructing their own worldviews and acting to create a sustainable future. So moving forward into practice, I put forward this idea of the transferable learning circle, which views language and our learners as holistic in relation to our environment and the past, present, and future. What this does is activates through heritage language pedagogy, epistemic learning or unlearning, thinking and knowledge exchange. And I've written here, heritage language pedagogy is a method through which all multicultural and multilingual learners, not only speakers of dominant non-endangered languages, can feel fully empowered and validated in an alternative, holistic, earth-centered learning process. And it also enables critical literacy, or a process of decolonizing the mind, involving the historical context that I touched upon earlier in the presentation, looking at things from a real lens and no longer telling myths in what we're teaching. It also embraces technology and multimodality to enable deeper knowledge sharing and co-creation, as I touched on before, epistemic unlearning, and also include diverse literacies and ways of learning, digital, visual, decolonial. It also helps foster a classroom environment which can help build sustainable futures and equitable and safe learning and sharing spaces. So heritage language pedagogy enables all of us to exchange in a decolonial exchange of knowledges, not just one privileging one universal Western system where we can decolonize the mind, problematicize the inequities of the status quo, and pose solutions to the major and real life issues we are facing, such as the climate and humanitarian crisis. So how? Heritage language pedagogy, the world of viewer log. As world viewers, learners are prompted to journal and reflect on their ongoing linguistic autobiographies or selves in relation. A climate crisis article written by an Australian Indigenous author is used as a material for a 5-lesson post-secondary English for academic purposes unit on the environment. And each lesson, in turn, focuses on rhetorical aspects of the text, lexical, grammatical, and cultural. So here's an example. Oh, sorry, just go back. So lesson 1 here through 5, lesson text, the text focus, some example of what, for example, in the rhetorical, researching the background of the author, the publisher, who wrote it, why, the lines of exploration here, bias, reasons why the text was written, and so on and so forth. So this table explains how I planned out the mini unit, what the potential lines of exploration were, and ultimately at the end of each class, we had the opportunity to reflect on that as a world viewer. So elaborating a little more, learners are asked to either video record, write, or create their responses to question prompts on WorldViewer online log. So it can be a Google Doc, YouTube video response, for example. Example prompts could include, according to the author, what are some of the differences between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems? How does that perspective relate to your own? So learners are encouraged to reflect on insights from their heritage languages and cultures and their own lived experiences, where it's not a subtractive learning environment. And here's an example of the reflection log. And for the sake of time, I won't go into this in too much detail, but I'll be happy to answer questions. So in the tasks and log, learners talked about traditional pre-colonial place names, what they meant, and compared sustainable agricultural practices in their heritage languages, which shared ecological insights about the land. We discussed the framing of the environment in dominant Western English discourse, such as degradation of the environment. We evaluated the impact of the nominalization of the English noun. Who is degrading the environment? Why is the agent missing? What effect does this have on meaning and accountability? So we shared ways in which we could make more earth-centered language and metaphors to talk about the environment. Why do certain people call areas of land wasteland, desert, or dirt? How do we relate to these words and treat the land? What would be another way of naming this land? It would be more respectful and appropriate. And here at the end of the unit, there was a world of viewer summary where we all shared our experiences and put it on a Padlet class blog where we discussed responses and prompts here for some questions, what are key themes, just to wrap the mini unit all together. So in this way, we learned English for a decolonial alternative lens, for a respectful balance of worldviews. We contrasted the definition of water. For example, in an English dictionary, it can come up as a definition of odorless, tasteless, but we contrasted that with the view that water is life and has spirit in Indigenous worldviews and languages. We also reflected on past experiences from our family's heritage, languages, and cultures and shared these on the Padlet. So for the sake of time, I'll just skip forward a couple more screens here. So basically what this does, the Transferable Learning Circle and the World Viewer, a heritage language pedagogy can assist in the creation of a more equitable and ecocentric classroom for a trans-systemic exchange of knowledges. We can stress the broader cultural and environmental impact of languaging. We can enable respectful knowledge exchange and learning among learners from diverse heritages and languages. We can enable learners to develop multiliteracies and also enable learners and educators ourselves to reflect on our own bias by enabling quote unquote critical self-reflexivity here used by Kubota. So the World Reviewer is introduced to exemplify how we can address the cognitive and linguistic imperialism of the colonial English classroom, validate non-dominant heritage and Indigenous knowledge systems and languages, foster discussions and orientations for a more environmentally and culturally responsive future, and promote the positive identity formation for all multilingual and multicultural learners. And here are just some publications on this topic that are forthcoming, where we can carry forward the conversation, and some references today. I would just like to thank you all for your time and for listening today. Tapaleif, miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you so much.